you very much, and good morning to everyone. Today we are going to be talking about detailed design, road safety audits, things that you can look at within that space, as well as heavy vehicles. This is, I mentioned in the last module, the space that I typically engage with our colleague, Jamie Robertson. He's the technical lead at Safe System Solution, and he usually runs this training, but is unavailable today. So I'm running it. So if this content is perhaps too detailed for you, or, not really, using terms that you're not familiar with or anything like that, that's completely okay. This is just used as a reference. You may be able to use this if you were ever conducting a road safety audit within the detailed design space, or if you were getting a road safety audit conducted on your detailed design. So it's just able to provide that little bit of context for you if you are working within this space. That'll be the first kind of half of today's module. And then the second half, we're going to be talking about temporary traffic management. Once again, we usually get a specialist within that space, Tony Bull, who has been doing temporary traffic management for decades. And he typically presents that, but he's also unavailable today. So I'll be running through that one as well. So I feel like I've got good exposure to both of these topics, and I understand, very much the principles and to a degree the details of it. If I'm unable to answer any of the really sticky questions, I will just refer them on to our specialists, and we'll be sure to chase them up for you. But feel free to test me. I'm happy to give it a go, and I'll be honest if I don't know the answers, and I'll just pass it up the line. So please do keep those conversations coming through the chat. All right, by the end of today's module, we're going to really focus on, well, what is the difference between a standards review and a road safety audit? They both certainly have their benefits. They both have their own separate functions, and we just want to be able to clearly articulate and demarcate where those two services lie. We'll talk about heavy vehicles as mentioned, and what the difference between a design vehicle and a checking vehicle is. We'll go through some swept path diagrams. This is something that's regularly undertaken as part of detailed designs, and can be at times just, snuck in as an appendix and not really interrogated, but there's very, very good reason to be able to identify what's happening with those swept path diagrams and to be able to ascertain any risks with them. So we'll go through swept path diagrams, lots of different terminology to do with sight distances. So we'll have a chat through that. And yeah, identify common road safety audit issues for detailed design, and then get stuck into the next module, which is all about the temporary traffic management. So I'll get stuck right into it and have a bit of a chat around, well, what is a standards review / design review versus a road safety audit? Those within the design space may be completely across this, and I won't be spelling out anything new, but for those unfamiliar with these terms, they do have two separate functions. A standards review can be undertaken by the design team, and it is just a check against all the assumptions made as part of developing any design. So just take, if you're constructing a roundabout, you're designing a roundabout. It'd be looking at all the lane widths, checking all the merge, lane tapers, all those kind of things, checking the circulating area, what is the radius of the roundabout, things like that. Going one by one through all the different variables and checking against Australian standards, the Austroads guides, and importantly, the supplements. So first question I'll give out to the group is, if you are in the design space, so you're doing auditing designs, and you've got those Australian standards, you've got the Austroads Guide to Road Design, and then you've got the supplements. The supplements are your specific jurisdiction's additions to any of those other papers. Which ones of those takes precedence? So which one would be most applicable to the designer? A few seconds there. And Karen has some internet issues today. That's okay. Karen will be recording this session, so you can certainly watch it at a later date, but hopefully it fixes up for you. All right, getting a bit of a few different options there, which is exciting to see. The answer is actually the supplements. So in Victoria, where I am at the moment, the Department of Transport and Planning, or previously Vic Roads, you can go on to their website and view their supplements. And it's basically, they look at the relevant Australian standards and relevant Austroads documents, and it picks out specific clauses where either those documents don't provide enough information, or there could be ambiguity, or for whatever reason, the jurisdiction has decided to do something differently. They've decided to depart from that standard. The supplement actually takes precedence. So the supplement is the most critical in all fairness. So if you are ever reviewing any of these designs and you can see, well, the Austroads guide says, you know, it should be a 6 meter wide circulating area, double check what the supplement is saying, because the supplement may say it's meant to be 5.4 or it's meant to be 7 or whatever it is. So the supplement is a really critical thing. All right. So that's the standards review. It is very much a check against standards. Just because we're achieving what is being set out in the standards does not mean that we are achieving a safe outcome. Okay. In fact, Australian standards, a lot of the ones that we're currently referring to are, you know, 5, 10, 15 years old. So it's a bit limited in the advice that they can offer. It's not necessarily a contemporary resource or completely up to date. So what do I mean by that? If you were designing purely based on what your guidance and documentation and all the supplements are saying, you can achieve perfect, you know, alignment with all of those documents. However, that does not guarantee that you have completely mitigated the safety risks associated with that design. A road safety audit is independent of that process. So it doesn't need to specify, you know, which guidelines that specific risk is referring to. It's useful if it does, but it doesn't have to. It can just say, I think that is a risk. You can completely above that. So it gives you a little bit of freedom as an auditor, because all you need to do is, you know, put your safety hat on and think, where could crashes occur? You don't need to know the ins and outs of the Australian standards or the Austroads guides to be able to determine why that may have been designed like that. You don't need to know that detail. You can just say, you know, oblivious to that detail, I think this is a risk and I think we need to raise this and something should be done about it. So a road safety audit is much more of a, you know, trying to push industry forward and trying to, you know, be able to show where the risks are and provide mitigating measures to reduce those risks. So it's much more proactive in that sense. It's not just a shit, yep, that's met all those standards. It's these are the risks out there and we should do something about it. All right, when we are conducting road safety audits for detailed designs, it's typically common to see a few of these points here. So design vehicles and service vehicles, or check vehicles for those that are familiar with those terms. A service vehicle is something that would be seen as regularly traveling through that area. So it could be a passenger vehicle, or it could be, you know, a lower order garbage truck or something like that, a service vehicle. A check vehicle is something that may be less likely to travel through there, but it could theoretically. So an example of that could be a B double, probably not within our local network, but could be on, you know, lower order roads that wouldn't regularly see that type of traffic, but perhaps they're traveling through there under, you know, traffic management with oversized, you know, those pilot vehicles helping them to attend that And that's where those two categories of the design vehicles fit into. We also need to consider what our speed environment is, the design speeds, urban and rural. All those things will play into effect during the design process. Vehicle swept paths, we'll talk a bit more of that in detail. Traffic data, pedestrians and cyclists. Now, crash history of the site, this one has got an asterisk because we don't really want a road safety audit to be driven by the crash history. In fact, I know auditors that don't ask for crash history because they just want to go to a site and audit it based on what they're seeing as the risks, as opposed to where trauma has occurred, which may bias their opinion of the situation or the environment. So yeah, it can be useful to have. So just as an example, if you're auditing a rural environment and there were 6 crashes that occurred at dusk or in foggy conditions, that's really pertinent information. And so that could help influence what you are going to be writing up as audit findings within your report. Every now and then you'll also get previous audit reports within the area as well, mostly relevant to those larger projects where you will have likely a concept road safety audits. You'll have a functional or preliminary design road safety audit, and you'll have a detailed design, etc. So if you're able to just see how this project has progressed through those audit stages, that can give you extra additional information as an auditor. All right, common road safety issues. So design vehicles and swept path. The design does not cater adequately for the swept paths of the chosen design vehicle, or the design vehicle is incorrect. So this was going back to what I was saying before, either having a check vehicle or, the service vehicle, which is more common, that's going to be using that facility. So that is generally garbage truck, just making sure that it can access all areas of our network and are able to safely maneuver around. And the check vehicles, we do acknowledge that, just based on the sheer space that they require, it's likely that they will be encroaching on areas that is not necessarily the carriageway. So how do we cater for that? And it gets quite technical, because there is definitely an understanding that those larger vehicles, could be in scenarios which are not an ideal situation. So they may be having to go across the curb, for instance, sweep across there, or access areas that are just behind the curb. Ideally, you don't want them anywhere near pedestrians, but I'm sure, as we're all familiar, that does exist on our networks where there are heavy vehicle movements adjacent pedestrian areas, and there have been instances where pedestrians are just standing on the corner of an intersection and just pushing the signals to cross the road, and heavy vehicles that come around, they collide with those pedestrians. And it's generally the front of the vehicle is okay. That's where you get kind of a larger sweeping radius, but a smaller radius. But the back of the vehicle, the back of the trailer for articulated vehicles like B doubles, that's where it requires a much larger radius to be able to turn in those movements. And that's typically where the greatest risk is there. Okay, I think I've got some questions in there, so I might just pause there. Zishan, in urban areas, low speed environments, is design speed still operating speed plus 10 kilometers, or operating speed can be design speed in urban areas? Yes, as far as I'm aware, that is generally still used as the rule of thumb, the design speed, operating speed plus 10 kilometers or plus 10%, I've also seen. But all of those assumptions you can just spell out within the design process, just so you've got a record of everything that you've used to get your calculations. And Anthony, IDM and other standards advisors of a design vehicle being 8.8, small CFA truck. However, waste trucks are more common on residential road, which are 10.21. There you go. Thanks very much for sharing that, Anthony. Yeah, I've got to say, I think the 8.8 is what I'm used to seeing there as well, but perhaps the waste or rubbish collection vehicles have changed dimensions. But yeah, I mean, rubbish days for today for me, and you can already see in the local area network that I live in, there are certainly struggles with them getting around, particularly at intersections, and it is certainly not uncommon for them to be able to have to access an oncoming traffic lane to be able to fully complete their turning movement. Another question from Chris. VCAT, in one case, ruled that the auto turn swept paths need to be performed by a bona fide traffic engineer. The general industry standard also requires submission, e.g. to cancel, that they're performed by an equally qualified person, i.e. a traffic engineer. What weight on road safety audit recommendations should one take if the assessment is not performed by that person? Wow, okay. If you were conducting a road safety audit and you were given the swept paths, you may not necessarily know who conducted those swept paths checks unless it is, initialed at the bottom and you want to follow up what their credentials are. You may be completely oblivious as to who did it and what their level of expertise was. So in other words, as a road safety auditor, all you're actually doing is reviewing that design, not necessarily checking their qualifications or mentioning any of that at all within the report itself. So you would just be reflecting on the design. How have they been presented? How is that consistent with how industry would present swept path diagrams? And you'd just be commenting on those factors. Okay, I might just leave that there for the moment and continue going with our heavy vehicles. So as mentioned, it is not uncommon for these larger vehicles to, experience that encroachment issues. Encroachment just means heading off into the oncoming lane or into other adjacent traffic lanes. The one that we're particularly concerned about is encroachment into pedestrian areas. That's certainly not a good outcome at all. So you want to be picking those up during the design stages and flagging them as risks. The reason I'm more concerned about that is because it only takes very, very low speeds for a heavy vehicle collision with a pedestrian to result in very, very serious outcomes, as I'm sure you could all appreciate, just given their size and weight. Conversely, if it's a heavy vehicle turning very slowly and they collide with another vehicle in a side swipe kind of collision, or even in a head-on type of collision or something like that, it's still not a great outcome, but it's unlikely to be as severe as with a pedestrian. So certainly in our pedestrian areas, we should be really interrogating vehicle conflicts within intersections and impacts with roadside furniture. So probably won't take you too long if you were driving along the network to be able to find signs that have been struck near intersections, and that is likely due to heavy vehicles just being unable to safely perform their movements, or the actual user behavior. They're traveling too quickly through there and getting their trailer stuck on signs and things like that. The keep left sign, if you've ever, if you're at a roundabout and it's like this, you got a little splitter island there, and there's that keep left sign in the middle. That's always the most common one struck, I find. You could also have hazard boards what's in the middle there. They're also pretty common to be struck by heavy vehicles as well. And yeah, just something to make a note of within the design, and whether there's adequate widths there to be able to allow for that swept path movement of your heavy vehicles. All right, within the Austroads guides, within this appendix, there are a whole raft of information as to how to conduct swept path checks. They are all done by auto turn, so software now, so it's not done by hand anymore or anything like that, but you need to put these inputs in, or you may already have those variables already set up within your software. But you need to know the exact, where the tires are situated, where the wheel racks are situated, how many wheels have you got, where the articulation sits. You need to know all of those distances, as well as the turning radius at different speeds, which is everything that's provided within our appendices here for the Austroads Guide. The way that it's typically notated, this isn't actually a great example, because when you got your swept path diagrams, there's generally these kind of dotted lines. So you can see it on this one here. You've got two different heavy vehicles turning adjacent one another. So they're both turning at the same time, making a right turn movement there. The dotted line there generally in practice actually represents the center line of that heavy vehicle, and those boundaries of the vehicle, or where their clearance is, that's generally a solid line. But I think I've got an example coming up to show what that generally looks like in practice. Yeah, cool. So here we have an actual swept path diagram that was produced, and something that we've reviewed and were asked to perform a road safety audit on. And we've got two heavy vehicles that are both performing right turn movements concurrently. First thing to note is I might just do a bit of a description around how to read this, because there's lots and lots of different annotations going on. So the blue, and apologies for those that are colorblind, the blue lines at each of those corners are the property boundaries. So they're actually like existing buildings. Our solid black line is proposed curbing there. The kind of orange you can see there is, the proposed line marking. So the hold line for the intersection and things like that, and the bicycle box. Next, you can see our blue line there is for our heavy vehicle on the left there. As I mentioned, the kind of the solid line here is where you'd see the edge of the vehicle as it performs that movement. And because you can see there's two lines there, it comes with I think it's a 1/2 meter offset. I might need to double check that. Or 1 meter. Yeah, I think it's a 1/2 meter offset from the edge of the heavy vehicle to provide just additional clearance or buffer. So that's what that kind of double line there represents. The inside line there is actually the edge of the vehicle, and then there's a 1/2 meter offset there just to ensure that there's adequate clearance. And then you can see the dotted line through there. Those represent, they represent the wheel tracks there. And the solid line with the arrows, it's probably clearer to see. I might just get rid of all this. It's getting a bit messy. The solid line there with the arrow, that is actually kind of the center of the vehicle. So you can see, starts with the center of the vehicle there. Appreciate there's lots and lots going on there, but as an auditor, you may get these designs, so it's important that you know what all these different lines represent and what they mean. So now with the auditing hat on, something that immediately should be of concern for an auditor, if you've got, the skills within this specific realm, is noting that there is not one smooth radius. If I go back to our Austroads example, you'll see here that the way that heavy vehicles tend to, or prefer to move, is one smooth radius. Okay? Even with these examples, it's just in that direction, whatever it is. So it's just one smooth radius of the curve. The purple is a really poor example, or great example of that, depending on how you want to say it. But you can see that there's a tiny, very small radius curve there. There's a larger radius curve here, and then there's another one here. They're kind of going in and out like that. That is not indicative of how heavy vehicles would actually travel through that intersection. The reason that we bring this up as an example is because swept path analysis and the software that you use, it is possible to doctor. So it is possible to fudge it just to make sure that it fits. So if you were to just take a really high level look at this and just be like, well, I can see that there's a gap between that vehicle and that vehicle there. You can see there's a gap there. That should be sweet, no problem. It requires additional interrogation. Okay, so you've got to be really careful about that and not fall for that trap, because it looks like what this designer has chosen to do is force this truck into this movement. What is actually being shown there is not a realistic movement, and it is very, very unlikely that the two right turn heavy vehicles could pass each other in this given geometry. Okay, so that is something of a, I would say, a fairly high risk there for this geometry. I might pause there for a second and just check in with Kathy to make sure I haven't missed any questions in the chat.
No, Max, everyone is all over this like a rash as
cool.
well. We had a comment in here too saying sometimes the clearance envelope width can depend on the speed of travel and turning of vehicles too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's 100% correct. It will be dependent on the speed as well as what type of vehicle you're looking at. Yep. Hold on.
Yeah, we're saying trucks should have 600 millimeter clearance from wheel path and not adequate width for footpath on the two corners as well. Someone's picked up on.
Spot on. So that was another audit finding that I was going to raise. Let's give a prize out there, Kathy.
Oh, okay, good one.
So that auditor's already got their eyesight, eagle eye vision spot on there. I mean, all the footpaths look a little bit strange, but particularly that quadrant and that quadrant, there is really no adequate room there for pedestrians to be able to safely store and access the adjacent footpaths. So that is a pretty significant concern, and one that would require redesign to ensure that pedestrians have connectivity through that intersection. So that one is another one I would definitely write up as an audit finding. The last one I was going to mention is, and this one, appreciate if you haven't seen this type of design before, you may not be across it, but these little symbols here are indicative of the pits for your signal hardware and stuff like that. So where all the cabling goes for your signals. And the dotted line is a conduit that runs generally the easiest, most direct way possible. So that's why it's drawn like that. The issue with that is you're actually showing you're digging underneath an existing building where the property boundary is. So that should be a pretty big flag. That's a pretty good flag. That, that's going to be an issue. You can't just be digging up someone's house to connect from pit to pit. Now, would you include that as a finding within your road safety audit? You could mention it, but it's really not a safety issue. And you really want to make sure that what you're putting within your audit table are safety risks and things that you've identified with the safety. It's incredibly likely that when this is to be constructed out on site, your contractors wouldn't start digging up buildings just to bring conduit from pit to pit, you would hope. So it's likely that that would be rectified on site. But if you picked it up as an auditor, you can certainly bring it up, in a covering email to the designer, just say, we noticed this as well. Make sure that's rectified, because what you may have to do is, install an additional pit, because whenever there's a change in direction, you need to put in another pit there or something like that, which would mean you have to bring out the curb as well. So it could have significant implications for the layout of this intersection and also changes to the costs there. But no, I wouldn't actually bring that up as a road safety audit finding. It's likely, though, that within a standards review, so when they do all those checks, something like that would get picked up. So one of the standards clauses would be, if there's any of the conduits clash with existing services or property boundaries or easements or anything like that, and that would not pass that test. So it's likely that that would get picked up in a standards review. All right, another example here of a swept path diagram. So this one looks pretty similar. The way that we've got, it's a little bit easy to see. It's not as much color, which is good. We've got a pink bus turning right into, just call it the minor leg here, and then a blue rigid bus turning left here. And yes, I can see the risk there has already been shared. Well done. You can clearly see that the swept path of that blue vehicle is completely conflicting with our pedestrian area there. So that kind of section there. So that blue, all that line work should stay within your carriageway. This is of a particular concern, not only because that's where you've got pedestrians, but it also seems to be like a staircase there. So you've got a pretty significant risk of that bus then rolling over if there are any vertical changes there. And yeah, just all this kind of associated roadside furniture or your signals and stuff like that would likely be here and here. And it just means those types of things would be colliding there as well. So all of those can be listed as risks, but certainly something that you'd want to be picking up as part of your review of these. Any ideas what you could suggest as a mitigating measure? So what could we do to reduce the risk of this? So we've identified this within our road safety audit as a risk that can occur. What could we say would be a recommendation? See some terrific answers coming through. So it's possible to redirect and get this specific vehicle type out and maybe off this local street and onto the arterial network instead. That'd be terrific. You could ban that movement altogether. Absolutely. It's certainly measures that we put in place in other parts of the network. Yep, you could look to get some land acquisition here, just take up a bit of this land to help shape that a little bit more and ensure that you're maintaining all of those swept paths. Also combining into a single lane, I saw mentioned there as well, just giving additional space so they can turn from this lane instead. Will be give more opportunity. All of those are worth exploring as a road safety auditor as well, because you are independent of the project. You don't necessarily need to think about, cost implications. So you can suggest things like land acquisition. You want to be reasonable with the team. And if you were, you were told explicitly, don't mention anything that involves land acquisition, then, I suppose you can write within your report, land acquisition was considered, but it has been determined not feasible for this project. So you can make a note of it there. But yeah, as an auditor, you are welcome to think of a raft of options, and you don't necessarily have to know all the answers. And if you are unsure, you can also try and cover it off, but just say, look for improving the swept path performance of this intersection and leave it up to the designer to try and work out what that actually means. That option should be used as a last resort if you really can't think of any other solutions within the space. But there may be instances where you're just not across exactly how that could be treated because it's not your strong suits. Ideally, you'd have a conversation with an expert within that area and get to an answer. But if you are unable to achieve that, then you could go with that approach. Question there from Elliot. As suggestions from a road safety audit recommendation, can we suggest to speak to the bus operators to review their bus route? Let's give a prize out there to Elliot. And I would say, yes, absolutely. It does not always need to include actual infrastructure changes. A good example of that one is recently I did a road safety audit for some protected bicycle lanes in a local street, which meant they were removing parking lanes, sorry, not removing, just relocating them outside the front of residential properties. So instead of it being, the nature strip, the curb, parking lane, bicycle lane, traffic lane, it was flipped around. So it goes nature strip, curb, bicycle lane, separator, and then parking lane. So it just flips those two around. Anyway, one of the audit findings was, well, there's probably going to be a risk that residents who are used to just putting their bin on the nature strip will continue doing so, or put their bins on the bicycle lane. So I don't know what to do otherwise. So we actually suggested as a recommendation, well, in terms of infrastructure, we suggested putting little bin bays as part of the design. So it's very clearly articulated or demarcated where residents should put their bins. But also just go and have a chat to those affected residents. So that's got nothing to do with the infrastructure. It's just go out there and organize one-on-one, face-to-face meetings. This is where you need to put your bin. Things have changed. And that's a much more effective way, because you can't necessarily design out every single risk, and education and that communication still plays a role. So yeah, I certainly agree. You can look to include recommendations beyond the scope of just infrastructure. I've got another example. I might give you another example there as well. If you have noticed, say, hooning behavior in a local area network, and there's already lots of local area traffic management treatments, and the speed environment is pretty much meant to be 40 kilometers per hour. It's just, for whatever reason, an attractive spot for people to travel very, very quickly and do burnouts and things like that. Maybe a recommendation there isn't any further infrastructure, but instead have a chat to the local police force and conduct enforcement activities. You can include that as a recommendation. All right, sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there, but a very good question there, Elliot. Thank you. Wonderful. Here's another example of, it's actually the exact same site, of swept paths occurring, one turning left in, one turning right out. And as made mention there behind a kill, you can see that there is an overlap there between the two swept paths, indicating there would be that side swipe collision as they travel through there. So something of a concern and something you'd make a note of. If you are doing detailed design audits and it could be an upgrade of an existing site, you'd go out there on site and have a look at the lay of the land. Really common thing to see is, swept vehicles traveling beyond heavy vehicles and their swept paths traveling beyond the carriageway, so behind the back of curb there. And that's where you can see the tire tracks and things like that. So that could be indicative of already existing swept path concerns or risks. So that could be ringing alarm bells for you. Another common one within this space, this photo was taken in the Port of Melbourne, but how the carriageway versus the pedestrian area is demarcated. So this is a very poor example of that, where the concrete surfacing for both the carriageway and the pedestrian area and the similarities in the surfacing texture there, difficult for a heavy vehicle to clearly be able to see where those two boundaries exist. And as you can see, there's lots of tire marks on the pedestrian area, which is not at all a good outcome. So you want to make sure that you've got contrasting pavements there or different surface textures to ensure that it's clear there where the carriageway ends, basically. But something that does pop up from time to time there. Similar to as what we saw with the tyre tracks adjacent to the curb, it's very common to see roadside furniture, signs to be struck there as well, and also damaged curbs. Also indicative of those areas where swept paths may be an issue. All right, we'll hop into sight lines now. And so that's it for the heavy vehicles. We'll move into sight lines. Very common issue across road safety audits in all design stages, but specifically in detailed design, because you would generally have more information about the dimensions of specific things. So, you know, where is the parking lane going to start, and where is the pedestals for the signal infrastructure going to be installed, and all those kind of things. So you've got a bit more information to work off, which can give you more opportunity to evaluate the risks associated with any sighting issues. So there are lots of different sight distance calculations and classifications, and we've got a slide just to go through them. But obviously the issue with sight distances, it's fairly self-explanatory, and you know, it's something, even if you're not within the road safety space. So if you ask any of your, probably not anyone in this room, but if you ask, you know, any of your friends or family, and you ask them, what's the most, you know, dangerous part of the road network or anything like that, and it's very possible they will just answer, you know, it's just this local road where there's this hill and it's on a curve and I just can't see anything, and as I'm trying to get out, I'm just kind of just hoping for the best and hoping there's no one there. So sight lines are a really big issue, and it is something that's where we see a bulk of our trauma occurring due to sightline issues there. So one of the sight distance calculations is referred to as SISD. Kathy, I believe we've actually got a poll for this one, if you don't mind launching the poll. All right, hopefully everyone's seeing that up on their screen. What does SISD stand for? So just to remember, there is no marking associated with these polls. So just, if you don't know the answer, that's fine. Just pop in a guess. All right, nearly got everyone participated. We'll give you another 10 seconds and then we can close the poll. So is it standard intersection sight distance, straight incline sight distance, safe intersection sight distance, somewhat impractical sight distance? And we'll end the poll there and share the results. All right, we've got the majority going with safe intersection sight distance, which is the correct answer. And it's basically just ensuring that a vehicle, as they approach the intersection, are able to sight other vehicles. So on the major and the minor road, they have the ability to see each other. There's nothing blocking that line of view. Very, very common within these environments. Property boundaries that are very close. Closer they get, the more they encroach on that sight distance. And also, of course, our parking lanes. Closer they get, they also encroach on our sight lines, which is exactly what's occurred at this side here. So this was another design that we audited where this road used to operate as a 4-lane, 2-lane each way road. Instead, they just wanted to make it a traffic lane, one each way, and then a parking lane. So that is the cross section that they're aiming for. And because it's detailed design, they gave you where the parking lane ends there, which I cannot read that little writing there, but out on site, this is kind of what was eventually installed with this Toyota Camry there, parked quite close to the thresholds. And this is how things look in our driver's perspective in a moment in time. And if we were trying to turn right out of this intersection and just a moment later, we may see something that looks like this, a car that just comes out of nowhere. So certainly illustrates the importance of maintaining those sight lines, because we don't want to have any of those sudden surprises. We want to make it as obvious as possible for vehicles exiting those intersections to be able to see oncoming traffic and not just hope for the best. Any ideas in terms of treatments, what we could be recommending here to mitigate this risk? So what could we do to open up sightlines at this site?
Max, whilst people are having a think about ways to mitigate it, there was a comment that's come in about the Off-Road Guide mentions there should not be any permanent object which impacts the sightline. So parked vehicles are technically not permanent. What are your thoughts there?
Right, and this is a wonderful example of where you as an auditor can extend beyond just what is written within the Off-Road Guides or Australian standards or whatever it is, and you can say, I as an auditor think that this is a significant risk in having that Toyota Camry parked there, even if it's only for 2 hours a day or whatever it is a significant risk of creating those sightline issues. And so you don't necessarily need to pinpoint that down to a specific standards or what the guides are saying. You can just say this is a risk. Your designer then
the guide is a guide, hey?
That's it. Your designer then may come back and say, I don't agree with this risk because I've done everything I can within the existing literature. But you as an auditor can still pick that up as a risk.
Brilliant. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, let's have a look through some of these ones. So yes, removing car parking, absolutely. That will help to open up the sightlines there. Bringing the hold line forward, that's a very good suggestion. So it's a little bit difficult to see here, but rather than have the giveaway line there, just bring it up a little bit further. That could be coupled with, making changes to our curbing here and, bringing out like a curb extension type of thing. So that would physically block off anyone trying to park too close to the intersection, and give you additional room there if you are trying to exit at that site. Restrict parking, undertake the SISD check and ban the required amount of parking. I've got to say, if anyone has ever done that check, you would be amazed about how much distance is required at all of our local streets and how far we are from achieving that. So yeah, I think the SISD checks are actually quite certainly on the side of being very cautious. And if we were to use that approach uniformly across the board, there would be a lot of missing car parks. Indent parking in a little bit. Install stop lines, stop instead of just give way. Yep. Isolated fixed objects, light pole obstructing sight distance can be ignored if I'm not wrong, Max. Yeah, see, it's a good question about what size does an object need to be before it's considered it could impact on sight lines. If it was, take just like a street sign or a giveaway sign, something like that, you'd think, well, that's super narrow. That's shouldn't be blocking anyone. But what about a light pole? That's a little bit wider. Or where do we create that boundary? I can see Zishan there put in 700 mil. I actually was going to say I wasn't sure that there was a definition of exactly what size is considered a sightline obstruction, purely because even if you had a sign like that, maybe a little bit bigger, but it had a sign on it, could be a stop sign, for instance. A cyclist or a motorcyclist, because they're much narrower, they can actually be quite easily blocked by just a sign. Okay, so it's all got to do with, you know, where it is within space, how close it is to the user viewing it, and where that other obstruction may lie. But yeah, it is possible just to have small things that can block sight lines. It's very unlikely I'd be raising any issues with, you know, any sign poles or anything like that. But utility poles, particularly if you've got lots of them in a row, they can kind of create this fence where it can be difficult to see through it. But yeah, it's a good question. Hang on, see, there's a bit more in there. I'm not sure if I missed anything there, Kathy.
It has gone off. Max, okay, so just to recap for you, the SISD at 50 kilometers an hour, Redrick thinks would be roughly 97 meters. And obviously in that example, we'd probably not have much parking either side of an intersection.
Yeah.
Bernard, I sympathise with you, Bernard, because I do also love talking to council about issues in my local area. So as a resident, Bernard can't win. How can we improve this? Yeah.
I wish I had the answer to that one. It really is a tough balance there of what is palatable to the community. If you tell them that we're removing car parks because it's the safety of people exiting this street, they'll be like, that's been like that for decades. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Like, they just won't recognize that as a risk at all. There's really no easy, you know, silver bullet there just to be able to, like, yeah, this is what we're going to do and this is the reason. It does need to be taken on a case-by-case basis and try to use facts and as much evidence as possible to help influence the community. But
Chris has got an idea. Put your bins out in the parking space. That might work temporarily.
There you go. Absolutely.
Oh no, Joshua. Sorry, Joshua.
Very good.
We should have a break shortly, Max. So we just.
I was going to say, let's have a break. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a break on this screen here, so you can just, if you are interested in learning more about the different types of sight distances, have a flick through those. Otherwise, we'll have 5 minutes, and my clock says that will be 11:02, and then we'll join each other again.
That's brilliant, Max. And maybe a letter to council listing all of the different sight distances might be an approach. I think we can workshop that later. Anyway. I'm
sure council would love to receive that. Just don't mention that
all the local government people here who have to respond to concerned residents are just loving this right now. Yeah.
All right, back in 5.
5 minute break. Thank you.
Next, I'm just going to go through a couple different road scenarios and just some common issues that you may find within them. So take a look at this example, a remote, rural, unsealed road. What you'd typically find if you were an auditor conducting an RSA within this environment, you'd be looking out for things like, the see-through effect. Yeah, feel free to chuck any ideas that you've got in the chat. Any, laminations or effects on the pavement itself. So whether there's any potholes or things like that. Wildlife, absolutely. Your sight lines here would also be an issue, particularly if you've got any curves. But generally these roads are dead straight for 20,000, 2,000 kilometers or whatever it is. Surface conditions, different times of the day and different conditions. Because the sheer number of users that we have here are not very high, it's unlikely to see significant capital being invested in these types of roads. So as an auditor, that may then influence you as, you know, what you may be suggesting as treatments. So you may not be suggesting, let's do, you know, full containment barrier along the entire length, because that will cost $2.5 billion. Instead, you may be saying, well, can we just do some guideposts that are, you know, evenly spaced so we can demarcate the edge of the carriageway, and some warning signs, you know, of the vertical change there, so like a dip sign or things like that. Yeah, so it can be a little bit geared towards what would likely be installed there, just given the actual road scenario. For intersections, now these are just some dot points here. As I mentioned in the previous module that we did, we do have within the Austroads guides the prompt lists. So I've got some slides at the end here today just to go through that in a bit more detail, but there's just some common issues that could be found within intersections. I won't go through them all. Similarly, at mid-block, we've got some typical types of risks that are found. And if you've got any questions about what any of those topics means, feel free to give me an email. But you may have also realized that some of these topics are what we have got you to present as part of your first assignment. So you'll be able to share that assignment and read other people's assignments as part of this program as well. So you may be able to just get some more information from your peers. All right. Now we'll talk about temporary traffic management, or, you know, construction sites, basically wherever there may be a, you know, any changes to the road network that could be temporary in nature. So wherever we have roadworks, and what are the specific things that we may be looking out for in a road safety audit there. Once again, there are a few different terms that you should be aware of within the roads, within the temporary traffic management space. So I may refer to that as just TTM, temporary traffic management. A road safety audit is once again separate to a compliance audit. Compliance audit may happen every day out on site. It may happen twice a day, you know, during peak periods and then during the night time, just to make sure that all the signs are upright, the flags are on the signs when there's workers there, and everything's visible and nothing's been lost or stolen or anything like that. Compliance, much more of a, yep, that's there, that's there, that's there, that's there, that's done. A road safety audit is, once again, bigger picture, thinking of the safety of all road users within the area. How they may react when they see the roadworks, you know, set up at this specific location. Have all the local connecting streets to where the construction is occurring, has that been set up adequately, and are they aware of the change conditions occurring? Yeah, more of those broader issues. And it could even be thinking about, you know, how do pedestrians and cyclists continue their journey within this space, which is a really, really common issue for RSAs within this space. But there are two kind of tiers, I suppose you could call them. Does anyone know the difference between a TGS and a TMP? So a traffic guidance scheme and a traffic management plan. Give you a second to have a think about that. TGS and TMP. Certainly looks like we've got some people that have been involved within this space. And yes, seems like we've all got the same answers there, which a TGS is kind of specific to the site and will show exactly, where your traffic controllers should be setting up all of their cones and signs, and how long the taper should be if it's closing off a lane and things like that, where everything should be situated, very site specific. The TMP is more of an overarching document to discuss risks. The TGS can form part of the TMP, but it could also have things like how you're going to stage the construction, how, any emergency situations may be managed and things like that. So yeah, it's more higher order overarching there, but well done, spot on there. We'll give a prize out there, Kathy, to the first one that answered that one. If any of these terms are not familiar and you are interested in learning more, I'd have a recommend you to flick through this one. There's lots and lots of material to help you through that. There is also, and Kathy, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also on our LMS recording of our colleague Tony Bull, who goes through this content in more detail. Is that true, Kathy?
It is totally true. It's like the sealed section. It's like an hour-long version of this. So more detail.
If I'm only just scratching the surface for you and you are particularly interested about temporary traffic management and how road safety audits are conducted here, I'd strongly recommend dive into this content here, or just watch the webinar of Tony, who is, as I mentioned, just an expert within this field and is all across it. I can give you the brief, the basics and common things that I kind of note on plans, but certainly not to the same extent that Tony would be able to share through his wisdom. And a regular one, which I'm sure wouldn't be too surprising or wouldn't be too difficult to gauge why this could be a risk, is something like this, where you may have a temporary traffic management sign set up with a 40. So you're saying that there's roadworks or something going on ahead. However, you've got the existing posted speed limit there as well. And Tony was actually on site this day, and he was an inspector as part of DTP or Vic Roads at the time, and went and had a chat to the project team about, what's going on here. And the project team just answered him, oh, that's got to do with the traffic management crew that we've got out there, so it's not really my issue. Can you give them a call? If you are the project team, everything that happens within your project is your responsibility. So that is a terrible response to have. You need to take ownership. All of these types of things need to be, as part of your remit, as part of things that you look out for. And so if you're flagged by an inspector as to not adhering to certain conditions, or you're not meeting safety requirements, you need to be certainly rectifying that ASAP and not just passing it on. Tony did, however, get in touch with the traffic management company, and they did let him know that they just ran out of masking material, so they couldn't cover up that one. So they just thought, we'll just put down the 40 there and people will know that overrides the other one. But that's a question. Does the 40 override the 100? What is the speed there? We'll see what the answers there are. I like the suggestion there from Josh that just do an average of 70, meet in the middle there, or combine them together, 140. There you go. Okay. So there's a few saying yes, that the 40 would prevail. Anthony's suggesting no. I actually do not know the answer to that. I was just raising that as a question. I would say a legal team would have an absolute field day going through that one, because you could interpret this as being redundant, as well, there's no other signs around there. I can see there's 100 there, and that's what I'm going to base my decision on. I feel like a lawyer would be able to get you off that. But I don't know. It's all
Like the
dependent, I
offside
suppose.
rule in soccer, Max. Sorry, I'm going to take us completely off track
Go
here.
for it.
But we could actually measure exactly what 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 the line of the anyway. Gone completely into
Oh,
technicalities.
okay. I
And
see.
see which
Yeah.
sign is a millimeter ahead of the other one, and then that one applies. So there you go.
Yeah. So it could be 40 from there to there, and then 100 from there on. Yes. Good thinking. That's probably the most like legally accurate, I would say.
Sorry.
VAR check.
World Cup is going well. Okay, sorry, back on track.
Yeah. But I mean, it's clearly not difficult to see why that is an issue, because you do not want to create ambiguity. You do not want to create this scenario where people will be driving to a speed that they think is appropriate, or they have, understood as what it is meant to be. You want to make it as unambiguous, as overt as possible. So you don't want to be, you want to be covering up any existing signage like that. But it is an incredibly common thing to see as part of traffic management plans that are being rolled out. Why conduct an RSA at a construction site? This one is quite word heavy, so apologies for this slide, but because they have a change in condition, and as you can appreciate, we are all creatures of habit. So if we're used to driving down a local road or arterial road, and it's always 70 kilometers per hour, and you always know you've got 3 lanes to choose from. And if things change, that can be very, not only upsetting, but can be quite difficult to manage just from a user behavior perspective. We're used to seeing the same thing and doing the same thing every day. So when those things change, that can be challenging. But the speed environment is also a really critical one there, where you do have these speed changes, particularly dropping down to 40 kilometers per hour in Victoria. Does anyone know the speed limits for roadworks within South Australia? That's another little trivia question for you. 25 is correct. Where you've got those speed changes, as I mentioned, because we are creatures of habit and we're used to going a particular speed, to drop down to those lower speeds can be also very difficult to manage. And as we know, our road workers are, because they are pedestrians, they're referred to as a vulnerable road user. And the speed that ideally we should be aiming for if a conflict were to occur should be at 30 kilometers per hour or below, just with our safe system hat on. So even with the 40 kilometer speed that we do have as kind of the default in most of our jurisdictions, SA excluded, we're clearly not hitting that target. But yeah, so we want to be doing an RSA because it's got that change in the speed environment, changes into, closing off lanes. Things are changing in the road, which is generally not a good thing when there are changes. There can also be multiple changes and multiple setups for a one site. So as I mentioned before, if you've got a larger project where you may have traffic on one side of a carriageway and then it gets flipped over to the other side and things like that, you may actually conduct multiple RSAs at different stages of that temporary traffic management setup, just to ensure that the risks are adequately covered off. It is possible, and I wouldn't get too hung up on this point, but it is possible that those performing the traffic management services are not fully across the risks associated with their line of work. And I've got to say, I've seen lots of companies that do it exceptionally well, and they acknowledge, it's a very dangerous job. It really is. And they are at high risk by, standing on a carriageway and interacting with the public and trying to force them to slow down when they probably don't want to slow down and can't see the point of doing all this, and it's a tough job. So that's, sorry, just from the traffic management side of things, but it is also possible those that are actually contracting that work, so those building the work. As an example, I'll use a property developer, and they are building residential development, and they have to slow down the adjacent arterial road network because they're installing a new intersection, whatever it is. It's possible that they do not have any safe system training or any traffic engineering training. Their job is to build residential properties, and they will do so at the quality and cost constraints that they have, and that's what they'll be focused on. And so if if they're required to do a road safety audit, and they perhaps don't understand the point of it, and they don't really understand the benefit of conducting these things, and they just take it as a checklist kind of activity that has to be done, they may also try and roll it into a compliance audit and just say, we've done the road safety audit because we've done a compliance audit, but no, they're different things. So yeah, it is possible that you will run into construction companies that will have this attitude of it's just traffic management, and they just have to slow down the road. But it is certainly a high risk activity and something that needs to be thought about. Checking that the standard arrangements are applied for consistency. It's really bugs me when you see the exact same site and they've got different temporary traffic management signs. They either use, some of them use symbols, some of them use words, some of them use different fonts. The thing about fonts that really irks me is it's surely more difficult to get non-standard fonts because you have to go and get that made up. But if you just go to a signage company and just say, hey, give me a roadworks sign, it's a set standard, so you have to go out of your way for that. It just really frustrates me, but something that comes up. To assess whether the standard arrangements are adequate, checked that there's no conflicting messages from permanent and temporary devices, as we saw before. Check that signs are used for their correct purposes, provide safety for personnel, to ensure that any connection or crossing of just general public is also maintained throughout. There's lots of examples of that not being achieved, particularly, so pedestrians and cyclists. I'm going to say cyclists is a really, really big one, where you may be closing off a traffic lane and your approach is just to do a merge, so it's just 2 lanes merge into one, with no thought about how a bicycle, if there was a bicycle lane, how that would actually be continued through there as well. So is it the expectation that what was once a bicycle lane in its own separate facility is now merging across the traffic lanes and is just riding in a traffic lane and has to travel at, is expected to travel at 40 kilometers per hour? Because that is an incredibly stressful thing to do as a cyclist. And if you're not comfortable or you're unable to ride that fast, that is also a very, very terrible outcome. But something that a road safety audit would pick up is, what are the road users within the area? So are they pedestrians? Are they cyclists? Are there people on horses, for instance? And how are their needs being supported by this traffic management setup that you've got in place, or what could be improved there? So there is certainly lots of work to be done within that space. A really, really common approach, sorry to go on about cycling, a really common approach for closing off, for traffic management schemes adjacent bicycle lanes is just to close the bicycle facility. And that's it, bicycle lane closed. And my little anecdote or, wisdom that I could share with there is, imagine if you had a traffic lane and you just put up a sign that just says traffic lane closed, and that was it. And you're like, job done. That's just unthinkable that you could achieve that. And we should have that same level of integrity with our cycling community as well. And if there's an existing bicycle lane and you're closing it off, you need to think about what is the cyclist going to do next and how we're going to cater for that. Here's one for a pedestrian though. So although it may seem fairly, low risk and not necessarily a significant kind of concern if you look at all the possible trauma outcomes that could occur within our road network, while we focus on a footpath, well, it may not necessarily be a significant trauma concern, but in terms of personal safety or the ability for individuals to travel freely and not feel like they're subjected to specific avenues of travel, doing things like this can be really detrimental to those people. So people in wheelchairs, for instance, or mobility scooters, the intent for this particular project was we'll backfill that footpath in during the day and we'll concrete it all up and hopefully get that removed within 24 hours. But that was not the way that it worked, and it was there for a week or so. And yeah, you're just not really providing any opportunity for people in wheelchairs to get around there, or to cross over, potentially going onto the carriageway, which then would become a safety risk. But yeah.
And I'm just going to jump in there too, Max.
Yeah.
We wouldn't accept it for the road, would we?
No, absolutely not.
Just be unheard of. Yet
yeah,
it's accepted.
And it's one of those things as well. If you have ever been in a wheelchair, maybe you've suffered an injury, or you've been on crutches, or you've had back issues, or whatever it is, or you've been with a person with those issues, you don't realize how poor, or how just the smallest things like this or changes in the level of a footpath really impact the serviceability of this infrastructure. So it can seem quite negligible, but it can make the world of difference for those that operate within this space. This one's a minor one that you could come across, and it goes back to that little rant I had about before about the font and different fonts on signs and things like that. This one is black on a yellow background, which actually represents a warning sign. Stop here on a red signal, though, is not a warning. That is a regulatory. That is saying you have to do this. So it should be, it should be on a white background with black text. In saying that, if you were auditing it, would the general public react any differently if the two signs were put side by side or whatever it is? I would like to think there is some aspect of the behavior that knows that this is warning and the other signs are a bit more important, but probably not going to create a significant difference, particularly if you've got this up and running and you can see a bright red lantern shining at you. That's probably more in, communicating to you that you need to stop there. Speaking of stop signs, I've got two here. I've got a octagonal of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yep, octagonal sign there and a circle stop sign there. What's the difference between those two? Pop it in the chat. Two stop signs. What's the difference between my octagonal and my circle one? Right. So people are picking up that the circle one is used for temporary traffic management, or the stop bats, which is correct. Both of them are regulatory. So both of them do have legal ramifications. The difference is within the road rules, they actually have different definitions. So whilst they are both stop signs, the way that the road user is meant to respond to these signs are different. This one is installed permanently on our traffic network at intersections where there's limited visibility or whatever it is. And the road will state you have to stop your vehicle for whatever it is, a couple of seconds, to ensure that there's no oncoming traffic before proceeding through that intersection. Okay? So you've got to wait there for a couple of seconds, but you have to physically stop. This one, used by temporary traffic management or traffic controllers, the road rules will state you have to stop until you can no longer see this sign. So until it's flipped around and says slow. All right? So that's the difference between the two. In other words, if you saw a traffic controller with this sign, legally, the way you could interpret it would be, I will stop here for a couple of seconds before I determine it is safe to go on through. And then you could drive on through. That's the one you want to be seeing. And conversely, if you see this rounded circle sign installed at a local intersection, legally you would have to stop there until that sign moved. So you wouldn't be able to just drive through it, or you could be pinged. Not that, I would ever actually give you a ticket for that or charge you for that, but that is the two differences between those signs. So certainly want to see the circle signs by our stop bats, and the octagonal should be installed on our road network. All right, when to audit. So we can audit, we generally audit during the development of any of these TMPs. So before it gets out there for construction or before the traffic controllers setting up, those plans tend to get reviewed. You can also inspect the sites prior to any intervention, just to ensure, if they're planning on putting a sign adjacent a driveway, which looks fine on Google Street View, or it looks fine on the aerial image that they have provided, but you go out there on site and you see that, that specific driveway is continuously blocked by vehicles for whatever reason, you could write that up as a risk. And then maybe we need to look at putting the sign somewhere else to ensure that it can still be visible. So very, very good practice to have your road safety audits completed, prior to any TDS being set up. You can also, obviously, during the setup or at the setup time is when you could do it. Once again, doing a day and night inspection, and any changes to that scheme as well should be audited too. All right, common issues that we find. Signs themselves, if there's adequate warning of the advance, the speed limits are actually consistent with what is being said on the plans, and there's no existing signage around there that would confuse anyone. Appropriateness of the selected standard layout, conflicts between permanent and temporary features. This one is a really significant one, so I'd probably put that one up first. Anything that could be misread or just, be ambiguous for drivers. Likelihood of mud and dust, really, really common as well, because these are adjacent construction sites where there is excavation and you've got vehicles that will be tracking onto the carriageway with dirty tires. Really common to see signs get dirty and dusty quite quickly. During the daytime, you may not actually be able to see it as much. It is the night inspection where that will become particularly relevant and that risk will be exacerbated. So really important to have that. Appropriateness of traffic barriers and correct installation. We have an entire course on road safety barriers, and it goes into the temporary traffic barrier world. It is a complete world in itself. There's lots of different systems out there. In terms of my experience, what I've noticed being on site is it's very common to see water-filled barriers used in construction sites, and the risk associated with them that I've found is they are not filled with water. So they are just giant plastic shells that are just sitting there, which is not doing too much. But yeah, they should be obviously installed with the way that the manufacturer has specified. Adequate for provision for pedestrians and any other vulnerable road users, such as cyclists, and conflict points between works traffic and the general public. So particularly on larger sites, you will notice that there's generally site entry signs, or this is where works traffic enter. How do you keep general public out of there? How do you make sure that they don't feel like that's part of just the carriageway as well? Similarly, upon exits for works traffics, there's actually an example of this near me, where when vehicles exit, there's a little radar, because they're traveling at 10, 20 kilometers per hour, I think the construction site is, and then merging onto a freeway, which is at 80 kilometers per hour. And as they're merging on, there is a sign maybe 100 meters down the road near where the merge point is, which has just got the truck symbol, and then it's got flashing lights. And because it's got that radar, when a truck is approaching that merge point from the construction site, those flashing lights will go off. So it will let you know as a general traffic that there is a heavy vehicle or a side vehicle that's about to enter the carriageway there. But also associated with all of our temporary traffic management schemes and road safety auditing within this space is everything else that we've covered. So sight lines is another really, really important one. Can you see all those signs? Are parked vehicles going to be blocking them? Is vegetation going to be blocking them? Speeds, how do we ensure that speeds are going to be at 40 kilometers per hour or below? That's another area where you may be recommending for enforcement, because it's unlikely you'll be suggesting any infrastructure changes there to support that. But anyway, just wanted to make sure that although I mentioned these in temporary traffic management, everything else that we've learned could still be applied within this space. That was all the content I was going to go through for our TTM. Did I miss any questions there, Kathy? Or I saw there was some good chatter going through there.
Yeah, lots of good chatter, but no, I think we're all good. Everybody's sorting themselves out, so it's terrific. Thank you, everybody, for doing that.
All right.
But we might have some questions, so it might be a bit of question time for you, Max, or for anyone. Sid's asking, could TGS be self-sufficient without a TMP? Is a TMP necessary for all roadwork, even if it's minimal, static, and located 6 meters away from traffic? I'm considering the cost implications that a fully fledged TMP adds to a project.
Okay, so I'm happy for anyone else to dive into this if you've got your own experiences, but from my experience, there are examples where TGS alone is okay. An example of that could be like a general, say it's a community event and they want to close down the main street because they want to have, horse and carriage going down there and live music and things like that. They may just provide a TGS just to show how that will be managed, and that will be it. For the larger projects where there is added complexities is where you'd want to see TMPs. Another example of just the TGS only could be if you are I actually don't know the answer to this, but if the what's the company called, RACV or something like that, say they needed to set up something really, really quickly just to give their workers who are, helping someone that's pulled over at the side of the verge or something like that, and they put their flashing lights on and stuff like that. can't remember, do they set up any signs? Maybe they don't, but they put out cones. But that could potentially be a TGS in itself. That wouldn't obviously be a TMP. Anyway, just me thinking out there. So yeah, I've certainly seen examples where it's TGS only.
Good one. Yeah, Shane's said in South Australia you can use a TGS to get a roadworks permit, no TMP required. There we go. Okay. I guess
I've got
any other. Yeah,
I've
sorry,
got
you've
some
got more.
Yeah, got a bit more contents, and then we can give people some time for those quizzes.
Great.
Cool. So as I mentioned, I did just want to talk a bit more in detail about our audit prompt list because I only touched on it briefly in our last module. In the Austroads Guide to Road Safety Part 6, you will find them in the appendix. One of the first tables here is prompt list for front loading. I have no idea what that term means and why they used it. I would just say it provides context or project background or something like that. Maybe that's the latest jargon that people are using. Very kind of self-explanatory. What you are trying to do here is just trying to define what the scope of your work is. You know, what is the traffic conditions? What are the road users within the area? Kind of crashes would you expect to be occurring here? Even defining things like if you happen to know what the traffic lane widths are, if there's a shoulder there, is it sealed or unsealed? What's the geometry like? Is it straight? Is it undulating? Are there hills and things like that? Just spelling it out in all detail. So these are prompt questions that can help that train of thought. They have provided it in a table format where, you know, you can simply copy and paste this table into your road safety audit report and fill it in as required. It is not a prerequisite to complete this. You do not need to have gone through the prompt list and submit this as part of your road safety audit. Okay. So don't be too stressed if you think this looks like a lot of work. I don't want to do this. It's just meant to guide you. Yeah. So certainly worth printing out and, you know, having on you, particularly for the first couple RSAs that you do, but I wouldn't expect you to be referring to this and know each of these points off by heart by the time you feel confident to be a road safety auditor. Lots of different prompt lists covering specific themes or categories. So, you know, for instance, if you've got a project that has got to do with pedestrians or the bicycle network, perhaps you'd flip to H.6, which covers walking and cycling. And then as part of these tables, the way that it's actually split up is it takes you into different stages of the audit. So whether that's a concept design or it's an existing road. And just once again sets out some questions to ask yourself as an auditor. These are things that could be risks. Have you thought about them? So just as an example, if you're doing the detailed design here and the of an intersection, this particular snip is from an intersection. One of the questions you could ask yourself is, have guardrails, safety fences been provided where appropriate? So you're like, yeah, I didn't even think to check the designers if they have nominated for any barriers. Should I follow it up with the designer? Maybe I should. So it can just help with that kind of, you know, shift your thinking into what are the road safety risks and what should I be looking out for. So really useful tool for you there. All right, few kind of key takeaways there is prompt lists are thought starters only. Stand back, look broadly at the project. A lot of the times you will have things within the prompt list that are just not at all relevant to your project because they are generic in nature and trying to cover off a large expanse of different possible scenarios. There's going to be lots of examples that are just not relevant at all. you do not submit your prompt list with the report. Okay. The other final slide that I had was just going to chat through our difference between a primary treatment and a supporting treatment. So this is a requirement within conducting a road safety audit. You need to define whether your recommendation is considered primary or it's considered supporting. There is a little bit of literature within the road safety audit guides about what that means, but there's actually better examples within this document, the Safe System Assessment Framework. So if you just type that into Google or into Austroads, you can have a flick through that and just type in primary treatment. And it shows you, what are specific examples or treatments of both the primary and supporting. So I've said those words a few times and just really wanted to drill this home so it's clear the difference between the two. A primary treatment is something that can virtually eliminate the potential of fatal and serious injuries associated with that particular crash type. Okay. So virtually eliminate, that's the kind of phrasing that we most commonly use, and that's what we refer to as our primary treatments. We're basically removing the risk of a fatal or serious injury. There will, of course, still be a little bit of a risk if road users are choosing to travel at 200 kilometers per hour or something like that, or those excessive behavior risks and things like that. But generally what you're saying with that treatment that you're recommending, it will virtually eliminate that. Okay. A supporting treatment, it's going to improve the level of safety associated with that particular crash type that you've nominated, but it's not expected to virtually eliminate the potential of an FSI, of a fatal or serious. Nor does it change the ability for a primary treatment to be implemented in the future. So it's not, it's not pigeonholing it into this is the one solution you can do and you can do nothing else. There is possibility in the future to install a primary treatment. And perhaps I might just do a little sketch here to show you a real life example of what this would look like. So going back to that safe intersection sight distance, we had a T intersection and we had our parking lane there. We had our hold line. That's a pretty good drawing. And then our vehicle that's exiting there, and there's our parked vehicles. All right, something like that as our carriageway. Now, one of the suggestions that we had was removing the first car park to open up sight lines. Okay, so if we put that in our recommendation, actually, I'll go back a step. I'll say, if I was an auditor auditing this, I'd say I'm worried about the sightline issues due to the parked cars. So a vehicle exiting here may collide with oncoming traffic because they're unable to see each other. So that's the risk that I've noted. So that intersection crash is what I have noted as the risk. I then put forward in my recommendation, remove one car park bay or however many car parks, to open up sight lines. That would actually fit within a supporting treatment. Because it is improving the level of safety, but this crash type can still occur. It is still possible that that vehicle exiting a minor leg misjudges the gap in the traffic or thinks that the vehicle is going slower than they actually is. So you would still classify that as a supporting treatment. any treatments that you could perhaps recommend here as a primary? I can already see one in there. I'm going to draw another card because I really like drawing.
Beautiful, Max. It's beautiful.
Thank you, Kathy.
Okay, we've got traffic signals, raised platform, traffic lights, grade separation, left turn only, RAB roundabout. Okay.
Nice. Okay, so
Are they all primary?
Bit to go through there. I'll first grade separation. Absolutely. If you are completely removing those two interactions, then they can't have an intersection crash because there's no intersection anymore. So that's definitely listed as a primary. A raised platform, if you were able to bring speeds down to 50 kilometers per hour or below, that's the speed that we are concerned about at those intersection crashes, then yes, you could list that as a primary. The traffic signals, if you were to signalize this, yes, that would definitely improve the level of safety. However, that crash risk that I drew before of the intersection still exists because it's still possible for red light running. So that vehicle could just drive straight through the traffic signals and you've still got that. So you have not virtually eliminated the risk. Okay, there still is that risk. So I would put signals as supporting. Closing the intersection of the side, yep, anything like that would work. The left turn only, it's a good question. So left turn, would you put that? It still is possible to have this intersection crash. Admittedly, the angles would be slightly better, so it's not quite perpendicular there. Yeah, generally I would consider that still as a supporting though. It's a pretty good question though, because unless you could get some real analysis as to exactly the angle expected from banning the right turn lane, right turn movements, what would be the conflict angle? And you could justify that it's not going to be 90 degrees, it will be much more acute, more like a roundabout. Then you could probably justify and say that it's probably within the survivable limits. Kathy.
Max, can I just want to take another moment to acknowledge your beautiful drawing. But what I'm going to do is take over as I do, because I thought while you're talking about that, we could actually show people the, which one is it? Here we go. It's in the resources section. We have the Safe System Assessment Framework. Yeah, sorry, my computer's doing something funny now and it opens up like this. But anyway, the front cover of it looks like that. So this is your friend. And if you jump down a few pages to these beautifully coloured tables, this talks about the primary and supporting treatments in more detail. So here the green is primary. And then the supporting treatments, I don't know why they split it, but they'd like to use a bit of yellow and a bit of orange. And so I just went to the intersection. Now, Max, if I understand right, this is not an exhaustive list of treatments, is it? This is just yeah.
That's correct.
But there you go there. Perfect.
So a really useful reference when you are doing your recommendations for your audit findings. And you're not convinced if it should be primary or supporting, just have a flick through that document there and you hope to get a bit more insight.
Which leads me, sorry, am I right to take over? Because I've already done it.
No, I'm all done. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. But if there are any other questions or any other comments, please don't hesitate to jump in and type them in. So we are at module 3, which is where we're at today. And there's a quiz, another 10 question multiple choice style quiz. That extended version, the construction RSA construction site presentation, is here. The video and also the additional slides from Tony Bull are there as well. Now, I did want to give you a little sneak peek into the next session, which is this Thursday, and just get you down to just saying it's not available. I'll make it available shortly. Over here, complete your road safety audit site visit. So we are going to get you to go out on site, and we have selected a site for you. And this was based on the address information you gave us at registration. Now, if you've moved, I don't know, all sorts of amazing things have happened since you registered until now. And this site that we have given you no longer works for you. So it's 300 kilometres away now. Look, we sent someone to Darwin, for example, or something like that, Warrnambool. There's lots of exciting different places in there, but basically what I want you to look for is your name is at the end of it. So please find that, and please let us know via email back to training@Safe System Solutions if this doesn't work for you anymore, and we'll conjure up a new site for you and pop it in time for Thursday's session. But we'll go through this in a bit more detail in Thursday's session. So please don't jump ahead and be super keen and start doing it. Just have a look and let us know if, in fact, you do live or work near that place and you're able to get out there in the next week and a half or so to do that. So that's in module 4, which I do now see is restricted until tomorrow, but I'll fix that up shortly. Did we have questions, comments?
Did you have enough tabs open, Kathy?
Well, this is low actually, Max. I did close some down because I didn't want to look like
stressful.
It's a little insight into my mind is what it is. Okay, sorry. And there was another question that I missed earlier. That a technicality issue, does a primary treatment in a road safety audit only referring to one, or can it be a combination of treatments as a primary treatment? For example, LATM and some line markings.
Sorry, I missed that. Do you mind repeating that, Kathy?
Oh, okay, sorry. So I had a question earlier about primary and supporting treatments. Can there only be one primary treatment, or can it be a combination of primary treatments?
Oh, okay. So generally in your recommendations, you would dot point out different treatment interventions. So you could say, consider installing a roundabout, and then consider installing a raised intersection, and kind of separating that way, just so it's clear that they are different choices, and also not to give any supporting treatments the P primary status if they are not in fact a primary intervention.
Okay, great. Side question. Is it correct to say safety in design is looking at safety within standards and guidelines, and this has to be done by legal obligation, whereas an RSA is a nice to have?
So the safety in design, there's kind of has Ken already done the Venn diagram thing, but they kind of do have a degree of overlap with an RSA, but they are still considered their own separate thing. And I wouldn't suggest one is more important than the other or anything like that, because safety in design is much more focused on, the commissioning of the actual whatever it is that you're developing, and if it had to be decommissioned and had to be maintained, and thinking about the operational aspects of your project. A road safety audit is much more focused on how you've come up with the layout and what risks are associated with that specific design from the general public. So to an extent, they kind of have different lenses put on it. Because it's more operational focused, the safety and design, you're generally thinking of workers that have to go out there and look after the piece of infrastructure, whereas a road safety audit would tend to be more focused around our road users, general public, that have to integrate with that new piece of infrastructure. So yeah, certainly see the benefit in having both of them.
Brilliant. I think we should wrap it up. Okay. Sorry, just one last question. If a primary suggestion fails, e.g. due to cost or space, not going to put a roundabout in the example T intersection, is it sufficient for the report holder to disagree? At what point does or who performs an alternative primary consideration?
So that's generally why recommendations, you like to provide multiple options for the project team to acknowledge that perhaps this primary is not achievable, and instead look into installing these supporting treatments as well. So maybe you can't get a protecting intersection, but consider signalizing it for that T intersection that I drew before. There's no real responsibility or matrix that suggests, if you can't do this, you have to do that, or anything like that with any degree of prescription. It's there has to be that consideration of what would be considered reasonable and what would be industry as standard. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Max. Thanks very much for being special guest presenter. Ken will be back on Thursday. Apparently Marissa will be back on Thursday, but I might muscle my way back in because this is a fun group. And thanks everyone for your participation and attention today. Catch you all later.
Thanks very much. Have a lovely day.
Bye.
Bye.